The black sand of Iwo Jima was already stained red, and the radio waves were screaming with chaos. Thousands of Marines were pinned down on the beach. Mortar shells rained from the sky like hail. Every standard code the Americans tried to use had been intercepted. The Japanese intelligence officers knew every move the Marines were about to make before they even made it. They were slaughtering them. But then, amidst the static and the screams of dying men, a voice cut through the frequency. It wasn't English. It wasn't a code the Japanese had ever heard. It sounded like the rumble of a storm, guttural and impossible to decipher. The Japanese cryptographers panicked. They frantically adjusted their dials, trying to match the sounds to any known language on Earth. They couldn't. On the beach, a Marine radio operator screamed into his handset. "Arizona, New Mexico, send it now." The artillery fire shifted instantly. It hit the Japanese bunkers with terrifying precision. The tide of the battle turned in seconds, all because of a language that was never supposed to exist in this war. This is the story of the weapon the enemy could never steal. It was February 1945. The Pacific Theater was a meat grinder. The Japanese military had broken every single code the United States Army and Navy had invented. They knew launch times. They knew drop zones. American soldiers were walking into ambushes because their secrets were being read like an open book. The military was desperate. They didn't need a better machine. They needed a ghost. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden history that shaped our world, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. Now, let's go back to the reservation. To understand the miracle of the code, you have to look through the eyes of the men who carried it. Men like Chester Nez. He grew up on the dusty plains of the Navajo Nation. As a child, he was forced into a government boarding school. The teachers washed his mouth out with soap if he spoke a single word of his native tongue. They told him his language was worthless. They told him to forget it. But now, the same government men in sharp uniforms were standing in front of him. They were asking him to remember. Chester stood in line at Camp Pendleton. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel. He looked at the other Navajo recruits standing beside him. They weren't just soldiers yet. They were architects of something entirely new. They were tasked with creating a code from scratch, using a language that had no written alphabet. A language where the meaning of a word changed depending on the tone of your voice. Chester looked at his notebook. He wrote down the word for hummingbird. Dahetihi. In the code, that meant fighter plane. He wrote down the word for turtle. Chedagahi. That meant tank. Ironfish became submarine. Potato became grenade. It was brilliant, it was fast, and it was completely impenetrable, but a code is useless until it is tested in fire. The transport ship rocked violently as it hit the waves near Guadalcanal. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing against Chester's chest. He clutched the heavy radio equipment to his side. It weighed nearly 30 pounds, a metal box of vacuum tubes and wires that was now his lifeline. The jungle was a wall of green rot. Mosquitoes swarmed thick enough to choke on. But the real threat was invisible. Japanese snipers were tied into the trees above them. They waited for the glint of an antenna. They knew that if you killed the radio man, you blinded the unit. Chester moved low through the brush. He could hear the snap of twigs nearby. "Stay down," a sergeant hissed. "I need a line," Chester whispered back. "You stick your head up, you lose it. If I don't, we all lose it." Chester crawled forward. The mud slicked his uniform, soaking through to his skin. He found a depression in the earth behind a fallen log. He cranked the generator. The static hissed in his ear. Then, the first test. A patrol was pinned down 300 yards ahead. They needed mortar support, but the Japanese were listening on the open channel. Chester pressed the talk button. He took a breath. He didn't speak the English coordinates. He spoke the language of the high desert. Belalas Letsodi, Wolachi, Moasi. Enemy. Ant. Cat. The translation happened in his head in a split second. On the other end of the line, another Navajo talker received it. He translated it back to English for the gunnery sergeant. Enemy infantry, grid 4-2. Fire. The mortars whistled overhead. Seconds later, the jungle floor shook with the impact. The Japanese radio interceptors were baffled. They recorded the transmission. They played it back. It sounded like nonsense. It sounded like water flowing over rocks. Back in the foxhole, Chester wiped the sweat from his eyes. He pulled a small, leather-bound journal from his pocket. His hand shook as he wrote. My country told me to forget who I was. Now, who I am is the only thing saving us. But the war was escalating. The islands got smaller, and the fighting got fiercer. Bougainville. Saipan. Peleliu. The Code Talkers were becoming legends, but they were also targets. The Marines knew how valuable these men were. They also knew what would happen if the Japanese captured one alive. They couldn't let the code be broken. Torture was a certainty. So the command made a dark decision. Every Code Talker was assigned a bodyguard, a Marine whose job was to protect him. But there was a shadow order. Chester sat in a foxhole one night, sharing a ration tin with his guard, a sprawling kid from Texas. The sky was lit up by flares, casting long, dancing shadows against the dirt walls. Chester looked at the pistol on the Texan's hip. You're glued to me, Chester said. The Texan didn't look up. That's the job, Chief. And if we get overrun? The Texan stopped eating. He looked Chester in the eye. The silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. I have my orders, the Texan said softly. The code doesn't get captured, even if you do. Chester nodded slowly. He understood. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a classified document, and documents are destroyed before they fall into enemy hands. Then came the black sand. Iwo Jima. The island was a fortress of sulfur and ash. The Japanese had spent years digging 20 kilometers of tunnels beneath the rock. They were invisible. When the Marines landed, the beaches were silent. It was a trap. As soon as the first wave of men struggled up the shifting sand terraces, the mountain erupted. Machine gun fire crisscrossed the beach like a laser grid. Men were cut in half before they could lift their rifles. Chester hit the sand hard. The noise was deafening. Artillery, mortars, screams, the roar of the ocean. He needed to set up the radio. He crawled over the bodies of fallen Marines. The coil of wire on his back snagged on a piece of wreckage. Bullets kicked up sand inches from his face. He yanked the wire free. He found a crater and rolled into it. 2 other Marines were already there, one of them clutching a bleeding shoulder. "Can you get through?" the wounded man yelled. "I'm trying." Chester dialed in the frequency. The network was clogged. Hundreds of operators were trying to talk at once. English messages were getting garbled, misunderstood, or jammed. But the Navajo net was clear. It was faster. While a standard encryption machine took 30 minutes to code and decode a single message, a code talker could do it in 20 seconds. Chester pressed the handset to his face. He closed his eyes, blocking out the chaos. He visualized the words. Sheep, eyes, nose, deer. He was calling in a strike on a pillbox that was devastating the left flank. He transmitted. He waited. "Received," came the voice in his ear, a calm voice, a Navajo voice. Moments later, a naval shell from a destroyer offshore slammed into the cliff face. The pillbox disintegrated. For 48 hours, Chester didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just talked. According to official Marine Corps records, the Navajo Code Talkers sent and received over 800 messages during the first 2 days of the Battle of Iwo Jima. 800 messages. Without a single error. Major Howard Connor later stated, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." But in the heat of the moment, there was no glory. There was only the next coordinate, the next life to save. On the third night, the shelling paused for a brief hour. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Chester leaned his head back against the cold, volcanic rock. He opened his diary again. The pages were stained with grit and oil. He wrote, "We are talking to the wind, and the wind is answering with fire. I pray the spirits understand why we use their words for death." Suddenly, movement on the ridge. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. "Halt!" the bodyguard shouted. The figure didn't stop. It was a Marine patrol returning from the line. But they were jumpy. They saw Chester's dark skin. They saw his features, so different from the white soldiers they were used to. They raised their rifles. "Jap! We got a Jap infiltrator!" one of them screamed. They didn't know about the Code Talkers. It was top secret. To them, he looked like the enemy. The bodyguard stepped in front of Chester, his weapon raised toward his own men. "Stand down!" the bodyguard roared. "He's a spy!" the patrol leader yelled, finger tightening on the trigger. "He's a Marine!" The standoff lasted 5 seconds. It felt like 5 years. The patrol leader lowered his rifle slowly, spitting on the ground. "Keep him hidden, then," he muttered. "Or someone else won't ask questions." Chester didn't move. He realized the danger wasn't just in front of him. It was all around him. The war finally ended. The guns fell silent. The mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ships turned toward home. But for the Code Talkers, the mission wasn't over. They were told to keep the secret. They couldn't tell their wives. They couldn't tell their children. They couldn't tell their parents what they had done. Chester Nez returned to the reservation. He took off his uniform. He put away his medals. He walked into the trading post, and he was just another Navajo man. No parades, no news crews, just the wind blowing across the mesa. For 23 years, the code remained classified. The military thought they might need it again. It wasn't until 1968 that the operation was declassified. Suddenly, the world learned the truth. They learned that the complex, unbreakable code that baffled the greatest military minds of the Axis powers was not a mathematical algorithm. It was the language of a people the country had tried to silence. Chester Nez lived to be the last of the original 29 Code Talkers. Before he passed, he reflected on the irony of it all. He had been punished for speaking Navajo as a boy, and then that same language saved the world. He said, "I felt proud. My language was of use." The Code Talkers are gone now. Their voices have faded from the radio waves. But the echo remains. They proved that strength doesn't always look like a weapon. Sometimes it looks like a heritage. And sometimes the things we are told to hide are the very things that will save us. If you want more forgotten stories of real people who lived through dossier 2, subscribe. This channel exists to bring their voices back. War creates heroes, but it also creates shadows. The Navajo Code Talkers were the ones who walked in both.